Okay, good morning, everyone. Ask everyone to go ahead and take your seats. We are ready to begin our study this morning as we continue in the book of Leviticus. We are in Leviticus chapter 10. We are lesson number 1, actually, in your book. If you have a book, does anyone need a lesson book? If anyone is in need of a lesson book, raise your hand. Our brother back will get one to you. Okay, so I guess everyone is good. We are continuing lesson number 1. We'll finish up lesson number 1 today, Lord willing, and then we'll move into the next lesson. The first lesson deals with the two scenarios that we found in the book of Exodus. We made the point that very little history is there, but these two things are talked about, and we will finish up this morning. Before we begin, we will begin with a word of prayer. Brother Tarver will lead us as we go to God in prayer.
Let us bow, please. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Father, we humble ourselves before your divine presence, thanking you, God, for the wonderful blessings that are found in your dear Son. Thanking you, God, for this opportunity that we have where we can assemble ourselves in one place and look into your perfect law of liberty for guidance. God, we are so blessed. We're blessed with teachers who are able to teach in a way where students can understand it. We ask your continuous blessing upon all our teachers, upon Brother Ulysses as he presents to us this study in the book of Leviticus. Again, God, we're so grateful. We're grateful for one another. We ask that you would continue to be with us, and may everything that we say and do come up before you as a sweet aroma. In the name of your dear Son, Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen.
Amen. Okay, as I said, we were in lesson number 1. We were to pick up today on page 5, question 18. This is the second scenario, the second point in the book of Exodus, which is in chapter 24, concerning some things that happened. But before we go there, we did just start last time, Wednesday. Before we go there, I was asked to revisit a point that we talked about last time concerning Aaron and his sons not eating of the sacrifice. And Moses was upset about that. We looked at a couple of things along that line. I went back and looked at some of those things. I revisited that and looked at it. The more I studied, the more I looked at it, I concluded that there's a whole lesson there, a whole sermon that can be taught. I don't want to take the time. Some of the points that could be made would take us in a direction that would deviate us from the flow that we are in the book of Leviticus. But suffice it to say, I'll just say this, that a couple of main points from there will be back a point of application. Before I say that, am I too loud to anybody? I'm getting feedback in my ears. Okay, all right. A point of application for us in that, we looked at Exodus chapter 34, verse 6 and 7, and we made a point there about the grace and mercy of God, how he is graceful and merciful and long-suffering and such like. And we made that point concerning Aaron. God was gracious toward him. The point I want us to look at, the application I think might be to us, is that of sincerity in seeking God and seeking to please God when we come before God to worship God. Take that passage that we looked at in Exodus chapter 34 and put it together with what God said in Leviticus chapter 10, verse 3. That passage in Exodus talks about the graciousness and the mercy of God, long suffering and that type of thing. But then he says here, by those who come near me, I must be regarded as holy, and before all the people, I must be glorified. There is a balance there that must be maintained, that must be kept. And we cannot overlook that. You know, Paul referred to the severity of God and the uh, well, the severity of God and the goodness of God in the Romans chapter 11. So what we have is a balance there. If we come before God, and the lesson to us, I just want to make this point about the lesson to us. When we come together, and this is what we need to think about, even on Sunday mornings, when we come here, and anytime we come before God to worship, we need to come before God with purpose, with direction. The difference between Nadab and Aaron and his sons was purpose. They were haphazard. They did not put full purpose. Apparently, they didn't give full thought to what they were supposed to have been doing, and they did something to deviate it. Aaron's and his sons' purpose for not eating it had to do with their desire to please God. Remember what Aaron said? If I had eaten it this day, would the Lord have been pleased with me? That was his concern. So he was not willing to do something that would bring displeasure to God. He knew himself, he knew his heart, he knew the condition of his own mindset. And to approach God, bearing the iniquity of the people with that mindset would not have been pleasing to God. The point I simply want to make there is we learned a lesson that when we approach God, make sure we approach him purpose. And I just want to say this one last thing before we move on. We need to examine ourselves. Well, Paul talked about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. How we examine ourselves when we take the Lord's Supper. When we are doing this such solemn thing, and we willfully allow our minds to be over on the football game or whatever else, and we are not focusing on what we are doing, remember what Paul said. Let a man examine himself. He in that passage taught that if a man eat and drink this unworthily, eat and drink condemnation, a judgment to himself. Now, that word, when we look at that word worthily, that word worthily has to do with befitting or fitting, that which is becoming to. So anything that is not fitting the occasion puts us in jeopardy spiritually. Does that make sense? Any thoughts, any questions concerning that point? If not, then we will move on. And where we were to pick up, this is page number 5, questions. This is the other part of what we were looking at in lesson number 1, referred to as the 2 narratives. The first narrative was Nadab and Abihu. This one is concerning a woman's son who did something, and he was put to death for it. We won't read the context. If you filled out your lessons, if you've read that, we've already read that passage. We won't take time to read that. But let's just go through the questions, and if you have some questions on it, you'll throw it out. We did answer the first question, number 17. And what sin did the Israelite woman commit? And what was everyone's answer? Blasphemy. Right, that was his sin. Question number 18 is where we're picking up today. Why do you think Moses highlights that the man's father was an Egyptian? Now, he made particular point, the point that his mother was an Israelite and his father was an Egyptian. Why do you think that point was made? How did you answer that? Right. Do you have a comment? both of those points, I think, can stand. One point was the man being the dominant character in the family would have had influence on this young man, so he would have been one who perhaps did not respect God because his father, being an Egyptian, had that influence on him. The other point was whether you were an Israelite or one who was visiting or one who was simply sojourning with you, not a natural Israelite, that same law applied to others. And God made that point. The same law will apply to an Israelite or one who is dwelling with you. So that's the point, the other point that is being made. And I think both of those points will apply here. And we do notice, just for a quick flashback, back in Exodus chapter 12, it was mentioned that there was a mixed multitude that came out with them when they came out of Egypt. And also in Numbers chapter 11, we will be there when we finish up Leviticus, we will move into Numbers. But in Numbers chapter 11, it is mentioned there that it was because of those who were of the mixed multitude who caused the nation of Israel to complain against God concerning their food issues and such like. The mixed multitude who held on to their cravings. Because of their cravings, he said, they influenced the Egyptians to complain. So that point then would be well taken. Any other thoughts? Okay, question 19. What instructions did God give the man? Give about the man, rather, in Leviticus 24:14. How did you answer that? All right. They did what they were instructed to do. They took him outside the camp and they stoned. Well, it is interesting. Yes, go ahead. Right. 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 That's important. If you witness something, and one of the things there, Max taught a lesson very recently concerning responsibility. Christian, how each Christian has responsibility for each other. We look out for one another. See a brother caught up in sin, we go and confront that brother or sister. I think the principle will apply here. If we witness something that is against the standard of God, we need to take a stand. As Christians, as people of God, we ought to take a stand. And that's the principle, I think, that will apply to us. That this man may have cursed, blasphemed God. People around him heard, said nothing about it. They, too, would have been held accountable as well. So they were, that sound going in and out, but it sounds like to me. Anyway, so that's the lesson we can learn. Accountability and the fact that they laid their hands on him, took them out of that responsibility, laid it all on him. That makes sense? Any comment? Question 20. What legal principle does God explain for the Jews in verses 17 to 21? That? Okay. Restitution, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. One of the things, there's the penalty for killing. He mentions the penalty for killing. And then he talks about if you kill an animal and this type of thing, there are certain penalties for those transgressions. If you kill a man, he says, then you ought to be put to death. But there is an exception to that. And just a flashback again to the book of Exodus, chapter 21. He had given the Ten Commandments in chapter 20, and he went on to talk about some other laws. But in chapter 21, verse 12 and 14, he gives the exception here. If a man kills a man, commit murder, the penalty for that is death. However, he said, if you didn't lie in rate, the point is, If it is not premeditated, if you didn't plan this man, it happened by accident or something along that line, then there was a way out. There was a way to get past death. And when we get to Numbers chapter 35, we will notice also there was specific instruction given for what was referred to as cities of refuge. If a man was striving with another man or accidental, whatever, he killed the man, well, the relatives of that man was going to seek revenge, or he was going to be brought up for judgment on that. So he could flee to a city where he could reside safely until he had his trial, so to speak. That was kind of the purpose of that. So God, in his grace and mercy, has still made these provisions. The law says you commit murder, you die, but God has given us provisions. If you accidentally kill somebody, then you have a right to be exonerated on that if you're not at fault. Right. That would be premeditated. You pick up an instrument of iron, say a sword or something of that matter, strike a person. More than likely, you intend to do some harm. Would you think? So that's an intention. That's premeditated. That's an intentional act. It's also, we won't say much about it until we get there, but as we get into the next lesson, we will see a phrase, unintentional. That phrase is used several times. If a man commits sin which is unintentional, God provides sacrifice. Certain ways to deal with that, but that's in the next lesson. Question number 21. With that principle in mind, what does this account tell us about how blaspheming God compares to murdering a man? Yeah. Right, just as serious. In the eyes of God, that's not much different. Remember, Jesus taught that if you hate your brother without a cause, it's on the same level as committing murder. So when God looks at the heart, God looks at the heart. Remember, God examines our heart more so than just the action. In our case, our actions are an outgrowth of what we feel and how we think in the condition of the heart. But God always knows what's in there. So if we already have in there what would cause us to do this, to commit harm in the sight of God, we are already in the wrong. That makes sense? So to hate your brother is on the same level as committing murder, because many people, how many people have you heard, man, I hate you, I wish you were dead? They don't actually kill him, but they say that. Now, hopefully they're not as serious as what they say. But if they are, God knows. That makes sense? Any questions, comments? That's okay. You guys get quiet on me. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah, the main point is the condition of the heart has to do with condemnation of the man, more so than the simple act, because your action comes out of the heart. Yeah. Well, yeah, there is a sense there where, and Scripture does teach, if you blaspheme the Holy Spirit, there is no forgiveness in this life or the next. Now, There's some other things can be said about that we won't have to take time to get into. But blasphemy comes from your intent. You intend to defame. You intend to denounce God. That's what this blasphemy is. And when I think about blasphemy, it's not sometimes when people talk about cursing, and we hear curse, and sometimes they might say, "Oh, I'm sorry, that's it." Well, two things can be said about it. One thing, first, is if it's not in there, it can't slip out. But sometimes people get into habits of certain words, and things might, to some degree, slip. But blasphemy here is an intentional thing. You intend to defame. This man who blasphemed, in my thinking, he's fighting with this man. And in order to try to inflict some mental anguish, I guess, on this man, he brings his God into the intentional. So that becomes something that needs to keep in mind. It is an intentional. It is. Exodus. Uh, yeah, God is creator. We are the created. We are to respect. So disrespecting God and murder is on basically the same level, so to speak. So we need to be careful not to disrespect God. Question number 22. How did the people respond to God's instruction? Basically, the question always, that's the repeat of question 19. Yes, they did what they were told to do. They took him out, laid their hands on him, and the whole congregation stoned him till he died. It's a serious matter, very serious thing. But the lesson to us, however, is be serious, be purposeful in how we live. Don't just be haphazard. Don't just say frivolous things. Scripture does teach also that we will give account to every word that is spoken. When we speak, when we talk to people, what we say, when we stand before the judgment seat of God, God's going to bring that up. Say, hey, tell me about that. We need to be ready to give an answer, give account. I can imagine. Well, I don't want to imagine. Yeah. Any thoughts? Yes. Well, in a sense, it could be. Blaspheming is disrespecting God and defaming God in the sense that you don't respect God enough to do what he says. I guess to that level it could. But blasphemy mainly is an intentional defamation. Basically, that that's my understanding of blasphemy. But in the sense that a person dishonor God and disrespect God to the point where they say, "Look, I know you said this, God, but I don't care. I'm not." That's disrespect, and that could pretty much be on the same level. Blasphemy. Yeah. For God's standard, God's law, no. I mean, God's law stands for all mankind, period. The fact that God's law stands. God is God of the universe. God's standard is God's standard for all of his creation. Now, a person who is a Christian is a person who has submitted themselves to the rule of Christ. Now, they have made that decision to submit themselves so they follow that law. The person who has not submitted themselves to the law of Christ, they are outside anyway, but if they're already committing atrocities against God by their obedience, that's just an add-on. When they do these other things that God teaches them, tell us not to do, that's simply a part of their disobedience. But when they decide to get right with God, all of that will have to come into play, have to come under God's standard. So God's standard covers all men. So any man, to be right with God, will have to come under that standard. That makes sense? Right. Right. Everything comes out of the heart. Your words come out of the heart. So what you speak will either justify or condemn the passage that you heard. Yes. One more. Let's move. Okay. What was that passage you find? Matthew 12. Matthew, Matthew 12, 34 to 37. One less comment. You had to come. Right. Okay. I thought I saw another hand down the way. Uh, the last two questions kind of brings these two things to a conclusion, brings the point to us. 23 says, though these two narratives are very different, what principle do they both illustrate? How did you answer that? Is there a principle illustrated by these two narratives? If so, what is it? Okay, God commandment of all. Right. Right. Sin is what it is. Sin is sin. They show the importance, what I was thinking, of having respect and honor and obedience toward God. That's the gist of both of these. The case of Nadab and Abihu, and in the case of this man who blasphemed. It was a matter of not honoring God in the way that he should be honored. So considering one narrative is toward the beginning of the book and the second toward the latter part of the book, uh, what does this shared principle accounts tell us about the purpose of the book of Leviticus? What are your thoughts? Does that illustrate any purpose of the book? If so, what would that purpose be? No thought? But my thought was this. I'm sorry, go ahead. Okay. As we begin, we made the point that the book of Leviticus is God's guidebook for his newly redeemed people he brought out of Egypt, preparing them now to be something. This is the guidebook to teach them how to worship. As we go into the next lesson, we'll begin to look at sacrifices, the offerings, and all of these things God set in place. So the book of Leviticus is basically that book that sets all of these things in place. And what we see there is God is very specific. He's meticulous. He says he gives a lot of detail. Just like in the book of Exodus, when he told Moses to build a tabernacle, he said, be sure that you build it according to the pattern that I showed you on the mountain. So now, as he's beginning to lay down their manner of worship, he is very specific. He's teaching them to do what I say. So the purpose, you might say, if you bring these two narratives into focus, God wants to impress, or the writer of this wants to impress upon the people of Israel that God is to be revered. God is holy, and he is to be honored above all else. Above everything else, God is holy, and he is to be revered. And we take all of those things that have been taught, bring it all into one focus. That's the point. We cannot forget that. Any questions? I mean, right. Consequences are very severe. Yes. Right. The point was, the lesson to us is that even in the New Testament, God has given a pattern. And when God gives a pattern, we need to be careful to know what it is to follow it. Yes. But the point was made that some people may have the idea that since it appears that the New Testament is not as precise as the book of Leviticus in laying out these modes of worship, some people don't take it as serious. Think God maybe has stepped back on his standard, whatever his expectation. I'll just make this point. Many of the specifics that we see in the Old Testament had to do with sacrifices, offerings, these things had to do with the temple and all of these things. That had to do with those specific things which in itself served as symbolism to us. So those things, since it served as symbolism to us, they don't apply to us on that same level. However, the symbolism, the things that it symbolizes, does. And the points that we learn, the lessons that we learn, like Sister Monk made up a little while ago, God lays out a pattern he expects us to follow. That's a lesson that we learn from that. The specifics don't apply to us, but the principles do. And I've often said, and I've heard of some other people saying as well, that God's standard has always been the same. God has never changed his standard. We read through the Old Testament and we see things that God imposed upon the people that is not for us today. And we may think God has changed his standard. God has never changed his standard. He simply changed the way he expects men to meet that standard. That makes sense? God's standard of righteousness, God's standard for man has never changed. He is who he is, and he will never change who he is. So that's one of the lessons we need to bear in mind. Yeah. Right. I think that's a good point. How we approach God and how we approach other people. And the observation has been made, even when you read through the Ten Commandments. One section deals specifically with how men relate to God, and the other part is how men relate to each other. So that's kind of like that's the basics of life. We relate to God, we relate to each other. Someone has demonstrated it even in the cross. No, I won't say that's scripturally the way to do it that way, but that the point is well taken. You have the vertical beam and you have the horizontal beam. Vertical beam is our relationship with God, and the horizontal beam is our relationship with our fellow men, people around us. And both of those are important. And the point that our brother was making was, as we raise our children just like that, God has that same expectation for us. We'll have the proper attitude toward Him and the proper relationship with Him. Yes, yes, I'm sorry, go ahead. Right, right. You know, on the flip side of that, if the whole congregation does not condemn it, the whole congregation bear the consequence. Just as a quick example that comes to my mind, remember when the people were going in to conquer the land, the Battle of Ai, they had already defeated this great city of Jericho. Now this city of Ai, they figured, oh, that's a small city, we can take it. They got beat. And the reason they got beat was because somebody had done what God told them not. One man had done what God told him not to do. And the whole congregation had to deal with it. So that's the principle we have. That's part of the thing that, going back to, again, the lesson that Mac taught, uh, accountability to one another. We are all accountable to each other. That makes sense? Any questions, any other comments before we move into lesson 2? So when you look at right, right, trust and obey. So that's important. That's why we sing that song. So that's one of the lessons that we learned from that first lesson, those two narratives. The necessity of taking God seriously, taking ourselves and our approach to God seriously, and not be haphazard about it. And the thing I like to caution everyone, as caution myself as well, in less than a half an hour, we will be gathering here to worship God. We will sing some songs, we'll have prayers, take the Lord's Supper. All those things that's a part of our worship. We need to be careful that we're not just going through the motions. But that becomes problematic. That's the lesson I think we need to grab out of this scenario. Nadab and Abihu in particular. And the point that was made about Aaron not partaking of that goat was that he was mindful of his heavy heart. His boys had been killed, and he had to bear the sin of the nation. He was not in the proper mindset to do that. We need to be mindful. we approach God, approach him as the holy God that he is, with the mindset that we are worshiping the holy God. And we cannot allow ourselves to be haphazard and let be, especially willfully. We sit here and the preachers are preaching sometimes, but we're not learning anything about what he said. We think about, man, I wonder if the Cowboys going to win. They might, but that's not our. At this moment, we are worshiping God. Make sense? Any comment? Okay, lesson number 2 begins to deal with sacrifices. It takes us back to chapter 1 of Leviticus. The first 7 chapters of Leviticus deals with a series of sacrifices and offerings that they were to make. And if you read through that, you noticed how detailed, specific God was in the things that he laid out. So there are a couple of things we'll notice as we go through. We won't make the observations up front. But we made the point at the beginning of the study that these things are for our learning. We also made the point that these things are symbolic. So as we go through these sacrifices, that there will be points we want to make that application, how it comes across to us. And anyway, the point in the application we can learn. But anyways, let's begin with question number 1. It says, what was the very last thing that happened in Exodus? As we enter the book of Exodus, yes. Okay. The tabernacle was completed, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. That was a word I referred to, and I realized I probably dealt with that. Anyway, that was a question I referred to as we began this study. That word was Shekinah. And I asked if anyone was familiar with that word. So, is anyone familiar with that word, Shekinah? Shekinah glory. When I was in Bible college, I used to hear people say, make reference to the Shekinah glory of God, the Shekinah glory. Well, that's what this is. What we read about in the end of Exodus is the Shekinah glory. The glory of God resting on the temple. The word Shekinah means resting or settling. God's glory settled here. And the point was made also that was God's stamp of approval. God gave them instructions. They followed his instruction. And it's like a teacher now. She takes your test grade, your test paper, looked at it and put the check mark. Good job. So that's what God's telling the nation of Israel. Good job. That makes sense? So that was happening. Question number 2. What is the very first thing God tells Moses in Leviticus 1? In this section we're looking at, verses chapter 1 through 7. What's the very first thing God said to Moses? 1? Yeah. Right. Very specific. God gave instruction. Look at verse 2. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when anyone, well, he begins to speak, that was, yes, I was looking. But what he does there is to give them specific instructions as to how to worship. That's the point we made before. To instruct them, to teach them about these various sacrifices. And beginning here, he's going to lay out each sacrifice, each offering, what animal can be used. He talks about how they'll be cut up. All of those things are specifically laid out. So, what do we learn? Question number 3 is, what do we learn then about what it takes for God to dwell with his people? But that's the question. I didn't write this question, but that's the question. What do we learn about what it takes for God to dwell with us? We had talked about it in times past in a few points. We went through the book of Exodus. But what are your thoughts? How would you answer? I heard someone say obedient. What other thought? Okay. So sin has to be atoned for. Any other thought? The two things I heard was obedience, sins atoned for. Of course, both of those things are true. The thing about all of these sacrifices demonstrate the holiness of God and the separation between God's holiness and the condition of man. And if for man to have a relationship, something had to be done. And time is about to run out. We've already got the 1 minute signal, so we won't have time to go any further into that. It's going to involve blood and things along that line. We'll say more about that beginning Wednesday night. So, Wednesday evening. So, go ahead and finish, if you hadn't already, answering those questions. Look at that section between chapter 1 and 7, and we'll pick up with the offerings Wednesday evening. Thank you so much for your kind attention.